Hi, thank you for joining us. I'm Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Open Mind program. We are honored to have with us Judith Warner, author of the critically acclaimed new book, And Then They Stopped Talking to Me, Making Sense of Middle School. Ms. Warner, who is zooming in from her office at home in Washington, D.C., is also the author of 9 nonfiction books, including the New York Times bestsellers Perfect Madness, Motherhood in the Age of Anxiety, and Hillary Clinton, The Inside Story, as well as the award-winning book We've Got Issues, Children and Parents in the Age of Medication, which she spoke about at an Open Mind program in 2010, back when our programs were still in person at UCLA. Ms. Warner is also a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and a journalism fellow with the Women Donors Network's Reflective Democracy campaign. She's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, was a contributing columnist for the New York Times, where she wrote the popular Domestic Disturbances column, and a special correspondent for Newsweek in Paris, and has freelanced for a wide variety of newspapers and magazines. We are also honored to welcome Dr. Safiya Noble, Associate Professor at UCLA in the Department of Information Studies, who will join Judith Warner in conversation. Dr. Noble is the co-founder and co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry. She holds appointments in African American Studies and Gender Studies and is a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. She is the author of a best-selling book, Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, which has been widely viewed in scholarly and popular publications. We would like to thank both Judith Warner and Safiya Noble for taking time for their busy schedules to be with us today. Now, before we get started, just a few announcements and dates to keep in mind. Our next Open Mind will be on Wednesday, March 24th, with Dr. Justin Brewer, internationally known thought leader in the field of habit change and the author of the perfect book for the pandemic era, Unwinding Anxiety. New science shows how to break the cycle of worry and fear to heal your mind. He will be joined in conversation by UCLA professor Dr. Julianne Bauer. Please visit our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org, to see a complete listing of all our upcoming Open Mind programs. A few key dates to keep in mind: May 6th, 5 p.m., our inaugural Open Mind Film Festival for high school students for mental health, and May 13th, 5 p.m., WOW 2021, our annual fundraising event, this year a 1-hour virtual program with Lisa Kudrow host and featuring luminaries from UCLA Health and Science with celebrities such as Ava DuVernay, Mindy Kaling, soccer star Landon Donovan, Dolly Parton, and Dan Wakeford, editor of People magazine. And we are very proud to have People magazine as our media sponsor. This important event raises vital funds to support mental health education, research, and clinical care programs at UCLA. A few housekeeping notes. Today's program is being taped and will be available for viewing beginning tomorrow on our YouTube channel, which is located on our website, again, friendsofsemel.org. There you will also find a library of videos from our past Open Mind events, so be sure to check it out. Today's program will run for 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible in the time allotted. And now, please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Judith Warner and Dr. Safiya Noble. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vicki, for that incredible introduction. And Judith, I'm just so excited and delighted to get to invite you to UCLA. And I wish that we were together on a stage somewhere in a beautiful building at UCLA. So we're going to have to improvise here. But I'm so excited. This book came right on time here into my life. And then they stopped talking to me. And, I can't wait to get into this conversation with you. But, before we do that, I want to just say that there's something about reading this book about making sense of middle school that there is no way anyone who is over the age of 15 is not going to relate to and be uh, spun out into an abyss of all the kinds of challenges that we all face going through middle school. So I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you tonight. And, before I ask you to read a passage from this incredible book, I've been listening to it on Audible, so I've really been enjoying hearing you share in your own voice too. But tell us a little bit about why you would write a book about one of the most painful dimensions of the human experience in the United States, which is likely for most of us middle school.
Well, that's a great question. And I'll just start by saying I'm so honored to be here with you. And I'm so honored to be back speaking as part of this series, which is just fantastic. Vicki mentioned the last time I was here in 2010. I mean, it was just a stellar evening that really stands out about, one of my best professional memories. So thank you all for having me back. The question about why would I write about this? I have a sentence in the introduction that says, a psychologist said to me once, most people run from pain. I always run toward it. I just sort of do. I mean, people run away from me at cocktail parties. I always just sort of go for the darkest and worst thing because I find it interesting. Um, I was drawn to this topic really, again, through sort of dark thoughts and feelings that actually started before my older daughter was in middle school. I have two daughters. In the book, I turned them into one to protect their privacy, but in speaking, it's hard to maintain the fiction. Um, I just was looking at the social dynamics that were going on, normal kinds of things, and I felt them so intensely. And I started to recognize something right around the time they were in fifth grade, let's say, that made me extraordinarily uncomfortable, which was that when I looked at the girls in the class and the way they were, starting to behave, middle schoolerishness starting younger now, the ones who reminded me of myself, it wasn't my daughter and it wasn't necessarily the kids like her. It was the girls who weren't so nice necessarily. And that was a very uncomfortable thing. I mean, really troubling because that's not how we tend to remember ourselves, certainly not how I remembered myself. And I was struck, first of all, when she went through those years, sixth, seventh, and eighth grade, how painful I found her social experiences. It was as though they were happening to me. And I knew that was weird. I mean, I knew enough about parenting that that's not supposed to happen. Yes, we suffer along with our children, but we're not supposed to feel like it's happening to us. I also noticed that a lot of the moms were behaving in really weird ways, going behind each other's backs and just doing and saying things that were kind of funny because they were so middle schoolerish. And when my younger daughter then got to the same phase, it was kind of like the second time around, I had a little bit of a more anthropological perspective in sitting back and watching. And I noticed a couple of things. One was that everybody seemed to approach this moment in life with a kind of fatalism, like it was going to be horrible, it was going to be terrible, it was the worst. There was nothing to do but just sort of like that, pull in and protect the kids and get ready for battle, basically. And I saw that same middle schoolerishness again among the moms. This one saying, don't listen to that one. She's lying, but this one is doing something else, like all this kind of crazy stuff. And I found myself thinking one day, and I actually found an email when I was working on this where I said this to someone: who are the 12-year-olds walking around inside of us? who are the
Mm,
middle schoolers who are driving this
mhm,
behavior? Because I had been around these people for a long time and I knew they weren't necessarily like this before. There was some change that was coming over everyone, including me with losing my boundaries. I mean, I was aware of it. So that's what got me thinking about this first. And my first really deep point of curiosity was to understand what we adults carry forward from these years, and then how what we carry forward affects us, either as parents or in other situations, in our workplaces, in our friendships. Usually it's in groups, let's say. So when I was interviewing adults, clubs came up a lot.
Yeah. I live in Los Angeles, as you know, and I can tell you that mothering feels like a blood sport in Los Angeles. And I don't know if it feels that way in other parts of the country, but I certainly know that there is something that is so profoundly competitive. And we moved here from small town in the Midwest in Champaign Urbana, Illinois, to Los Angeles. And I can remember thinking, all of the like ways in which parents that was meeting, they were like going through all these different kinds of machinations to get to a certain place and get a child in this school and not in that school, and you have to get the points and make sure you apply this way and that way. And so there is something about um, how the lack of opportunity too seems to compress all of this competition into the culture of parenting these days. And it's so different, of course, than probably the era in which you and I were parented
Yes.
as young people.
Absolutely. And, a lot of the craziest parent stories in this book are from Los Angeles. I mean, and it's just because what's going on in the school climate, what's going on among the kids, but also among the parents is a microcosm for what's going on in any particular subculture in the US. And so when you have places where the adults are particularly engaged in sort of are involved in thinking a lot about status and power and who's who. So that's true for LA, that's true for Washington, D.C., where I am, even though in a different way. In New York, it's really purely wealth, let's say at this point. The stuff is heightened. And for a number of different reasons, what I noticed and then what I learned in the research is that it very often comes out in parents as well as kids right at the middle school age. So you have something
Yeah.
to look forward to. I think you told me earlier your son is 9.
He's 9 and I already feel it. I mean, I see it in my husband, who is 100% basketball dad. Do you know? So his own identity, like reliving his own basketball career as a young person, a young man, into our son. So pray for us. Okay, listen, I want to really get into this book because not everybody who's watching has had a chance to read this fantastic, magnificent book that I hope that if you're watching, you'll just get this book right now. Just order it so it comes in the next couple of days. And would you read a passage for us from this book? Because I think that's a way to there's so many great stories in this book, but if you could share one that will help everybody get in on the conversation. So even if they haven't read it, we can kind of have a shared jumping off point tonight.
Absolutely, with pleasure. I'll read a story that is at the beginning of chapter 1. The chapter is titled Middle School in Our Minds. And what I was getting at with this is just really trying to understand what these words mean for us. Why is it in the US? And this is not a uniquely, absolutely 100% uniquely American phenomenon, but it's largely an American phenomenon. Why do people shudder when you say the words middle school? And I'll just start off by reading a quote from Miss Manners, which was actually from 1979. The revival of the junior high school dance is, in Miss Manners' opinion, a boon to the social development of young adolescents. In no other way can they obtain those deep emotional scars that make people so interesting later in life. And I just love that. Um, okay, I'll start off the story. I had all the things that made someone popular in my elementary school. Mitch, a 39-year-old campaign advisor from the Midwest, told me late one winter morning in a crowded cafe in Northwest Washington, D.C. It was a time of day when, through most of his adult life, he would never have been free to have coffee. He would have been downtown in a glass-fronted office building, packing in meeting after meeting with politicos, pollsters, and other consultants, right at the center of the capital's money and power nexus. That had been his life for a couple of decades, and he'd been very happy in it, until what was supposed to have been a dream job brought him under the thumb of a boss who ran her DC consulting firm like a middle school mean girl, ruling by fear, ostracizing those who fell out of her favor, and using the man in question, her number two, alternately as a whipping boy and as an enforcer. She'd berate people, then have Mitch clean up the messes. She could be kind or cruel, sane or crazy, nurturing or raging, all without warning. Mitch started walking on eggshells to avoid her displeasure, angling for her approval, jockeying to stay within the sunbeam of her power, and trying to stay as far away as possible from the purgatory in which those in the outgroup waited for a reprieve. His anxiety mounted to levels he hadn't experienced since middle school, a time so dark and an emotional reality so overwhelming that it threatened to swallow his adult self whole. Mitch came from a good family, neither rich nor poor, just comfortably in the middle of those who lived in his small town in the rural part of his state. He had a father who could be difficult, kind of erratic mood-wise, but his mother was steadily supportive. She was very engaged in his school. He was a great student, right at the top of all his classes. And all the way through 5th grade, he had a lot of friends. When middle school began and his elementary school classmates merged with kids from another wealthier district for 6th grade, Mitch quickly made some new friends, popular boys from the other elementary school. He kept getting straight A's, and he kept getting invited to all the parties. But then one Monday in March, he came to school to find that his new friends had stopped talking to him. They wouldn't sit with him at lunch or on the bus. At assemblies, there were no seats available near them. I was dead to them all of a sudden, he recalled. They'd act like I wasn't there. Panicked, he went back to his old elementary school friends. But a couple of weeks later, they stopped talking to him too. The silent treatment spread from his section to other sections of the school and from grade to grade. It went from not talking to me to calling me a fag and other names, knocking books out of my hands, hanging signs on my back. It was just endless torment, he said. Mitch pressed hard for explanations, but no one would tell him what was going on. All of a sudden, it seemed, everything that had once been right about him was wrong. Having an involved mother was no longer a good thing, it was a loser thing. Being smart was no longer a good thing. The boys who were more athletic, especially the football players and wrestlers, they were suddenly the favorites, he told me. His teachers that year were all the sports coaches, middle-aged men who related naturally to boys who were just like they had been in junior high. They didn't pile on, they weren't monsters, but they didn't exactly throw a whole lot of support his way. Somebody like me, not athletic, not having an early growth spurt, probably exhibiting some signs of being gay, was not going to be popular, he noted dryly. Their attitude was, boys will be boys. The girls in the class took him in, but to be the only boy with all the girls, he said, that didn't help the reputation of being a secret fag. His parents knew nothing, and he told them nothing. He was ashamed. Becoming unpopular felt like a personal failure. Being called gay, a word no one would argue was anything other than an insult in his community in the late 1980s, brought to the surface something he was nowhere near ready to fully contemplate, much less disclose to his parents. The remainder of that spring was horrible. I dreaded going to school. Every day it was getting to 3 p.m. without getting the shit kicked out of you. Get to Friday, just not get hurt and not lose my mind, he said. Every morning, he woke up to the sound of birds singing outside his bedroom window. It came from a huge 200-year-old oak tree with wide-reaching branches that each year at the start of the warm weather would fill up with nesting birds as they migrated north. The birds would build their nests just outside his window. And every day, as he woke up and got dressed, his chest tight with fear, their utter indifference as they chirped away, just singing their heads off as he recalled it, compounded his feeling of being all alone, out of step, a total and utter freak of nature. For years afterward, he told me, he couldn't stand the sound of birdsong. He'd come home from high school and college and even graduate school, and the chirping would make him feel sick. Other reminders of that time also brought on a rush of sick feelings. Nintendo, 1980s clothing, even certain TV shows. He became an insecure young adult, hypersensitive to any perceived slight, hyper aware of any perceived disapproval or displeasure, as he put it. He battled obsessive compulsive disorder, a problem that had begun sometime in late middle school, after he'd made some new friends and then found himself engaging in rituals, odd little sayings, chants, and prayers, even a highly ritualized way of dressing to avoid repetition, all to magically guarantee that his new crowd wouldn't abandon him. Some vestiges of his old insecurities, and even the OCD, had been set off again by the emotional yo-yo effect of his boss's silent treatment and bullying outbursts. After less than a year, he'd had to cut and run. It was like sixth grade. I never understood what happened. I didn't know what did it, he said, then shrugged. It just triggered so much.
Judith, there's a lot in here. Listening to you read this passage, there were things that jumped out new for me, like that I was in sixth grade in 1982, right? And so Mitch and I are contemporaries, Gen Xers, and there's so many things in his story that I feel like I want to spend time with you on. I mean, one of the things, of course, that jumps out first is just this transition in his own identity, right? That he comes to understand his sexual identity, maybe even behind the curve of what other people are seeing or assessing about his identity. Um, I sense that there's also maybe no guide or no sense making through that process too. So, you say in the book that this kind of 0 to 3 years are this foundational formative years for a child, but these years of middle school are also foundational to our identity development. And I wonder if you could just talk about that for us.
Absolutely. I mean, the 0 to 3 period has been recognized for decades now as being a special critical period where there is an enormous amount of really foundational brain growth and development with things that have to happen in that period of time. That is, this particularly important time of both vulnerability and new strengths that emerge. And in recent years, neuroscientists have also realized that the middle school period, the period just around puberty, is a second critical period. It's another time when you have an enormous amount of brain growth and change, where you have new pathways being put down, you have pathways being pruned, the brain becomes more efficient, it sort of gets a generalized tune up, and connections are made, patterns are formed that stay with us for the rest of our lives. A lot of that has to do with our social lives. Some of it is also cognitive, intellectual, new potential opening up for new abilities to learn and perceive the world. And there's a kind of horrible irony that lies beneath a lot of it, in that we gain this new social acuity, this ability to see the way other people see us at exactly the time that we care more about it than ever before. And all of this is due to different sets of brain changes. So the things that are most painful to us, we become hyper attuned to. And the things that are most difficult, finding our place in the world, having friends, belonging to a group or not belonging, all of these things are just vitally important just then. So our vulnerability to the things that happen to us socially is that much greater. Our memory is sharper at that point than at any other point as well. So the things that happen are sort of engraved in our minds that much more deeply. And that's why, for example, the sound of birdsong would stay with him so painfully from that point forward. I'm sure you can remember the lyrics to every song in that time period. I know that I can. My best friend from that time recently, we started spending Christmas together again, and we we would listen to the Casey Kasem top, America's Top
You
40
bet.
for those years, because we did that on New Year's Eve back then too, driving our husbands crazy because the music is pretty terrible, but all the words. And all of that is for these reasons of brain development. So it's kind of fascinating, and it does seem just kind of like a cruel, trick played by nature, that at the most difficult time of life in so many different ways, we feel it all that much harder.
Yeah, and this seminar tonight is really about, mental health and well-being, and yet we know, of course, that these years are so crucial to the formation of this. I mean, one of the reasons why I think you and I were put in dialogue is because so much of my work is around what happens on the internet and how people are harmed and made more vulnerable, or how vulnerable people are subject to very different kinds of experiences, quite frankly, on the internet. And, in some ways, the things that you do when you're 13 on the internet, uh, I certainly, at least in my own work, advocate that those things should not follow you into your future. And so maybe we should just spend a little bit of time, because we're talking about how these things from this period of life stay with us, like the case of Mitch, like us, probably like most people who are watching, even with our therapy and our years of examined lives or our unexamined lives, we're still in this place of trying to wrestle with what's happened. Um, did you find anything as you were looking at these stories, especially you're talking to people, parents and young people, about how technology or what happens to them offline is affecting what happens to them in other spaces or places? Or I just kind of wonder, because I think a lot of people watching think that it's so much worse now because of the internet or because of technology than maybe from our generation, just a couple generations ago.
So what I found is that basically kids this age have not changed. They are very much the way I remember and the way they've basically always been. There are evolutionary reasons why human beings around puberty behave the way they do and care about the things that they do. And then, you throw them into a society like ours, which is so competitive, so unequal, all of the kind of status stuff just becomes heightened, and it's encouraged by the environment around us. Um, in a lot of ways, though, what I noticed is that kids were actually somewhat nicer in the current generation than at least in mine. I mean, I'm a little bit older than you. I'm the oldest end of Gen X. And, there at least is a vocabulary now for talking about sexual harassment, which there was not. The
Absolutely.
vocabulary did not exist.
That's true.
There is a much more developed vocabulary for talking about racism, white privilege. We didn't talk about, we didn't have this vocabulary in the same way for talking about it. And there wasn't so much a sense that it was incumbent upon white people to talk about it and be aware of it. They are ahead of where we were at that same age. Um, I mean, particularly when it comes to homophobia, which was again a word that I certainly didn't hear until I was much older. I mean,
Same.
the pervasive bias against, non-heterosexual people was so widespread. I mean, we had parents who still believed that it was a mental illness. So that's a sea change. And kids take that very seriously. And very often I've found that they tend to be actually in advance of their parents in terms of their sophistication and understanding of things like systemic racism. Um, so in that sense, all of those are good things. All of those are good things. There is a vocabulary around bullying now, which there was not in the past. There's a vocabulary around no one wants to be a mean girl. And the word popular has taken on a negative connotation. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't still do the clicky, mean girl, whatever things, but there is more of an awareness and a way of talking about it. Adults are way more present than they were in the past. I write about all the ways that that's bad, but there are also ways in which that's good. As you said, after I had read that anecdote, that there was no sort of guide given to him for having kind of some way of articulating, understanding what he was going through. There was no language that wasn't stigmatizing. It was just kind of a void. And I think that a lot of Gen Xers remember the feeling of kind of growing up in a void, for a variety of different reasons. Um, Certainly at my end of the age group, because things were falling apart. I mean, the divorce rate was spiking. There was, things where the old order was kind of falling apart without anyone having yet figured out how to do things
Yeah,
differently as well.
that's absolutely right.
With the
Yeah.
Gen X story. So all of that to say that we tend to think everything is so much worse now. I would say that kids are doing the same things at that age that we did and that previous generations did too, in terms of meanness, but they're doing it online. We did it through analog means. We did it through mean notes, anonymous slam books, hang up calls. There are stories in the book that reminded me of something I'd forgotten about when, it was a big deal to have like a phone extension in your room. The, you know, that you could have somebody over, one person would be in one room picking up the phone, calling another friend, let's say, while the other person listened in, and the person who made the call would get the third person to bash the other one, allegedly, in the name of letting them know the truth. All of these things still happen the exact
Yeah.
same way, except that they happen through digital means. I think what is different and much, much worse is that there's no escape. It's 24/7. And also, if you're on the outs in your school, if you're being bullied, if there's a nasty rumor circulating about you, it can jump school to school. So that makes it that much harder to escape. And I think that for that reason, bullying has become a wider problem because it's harder to escape from it. But I do think it's really important for parents to bear in mind the similarities, that it isn't true that your kids are going out into this new world of unimaginable horror. It is imaginable because we lived through it. Um, Also, I think it's important to keep in perspective that in terms of kids this age engaging in the kinds of behaviors we don't want them to, drinking, smoking, drug use, sex, all of that, the statistics are better now than they were for our age group, for Gen X, let's say. We were kind of the worst. Maybe there's a point before then when people weren't paying attention and noticing, but there's reason to believe that we really were the worst. Certainly, at least compared to us, their statistics are better. And part of the reason may be because they're spending more of their time online and not with each other. For what it's worth, it's kind of a silver lining to something that is otherwise maybe not so great. But there are other silver linings too. Kids who maybe are socially isolated at school can find their people online, and a lot of that has happened during the pandemic, for example. So I think it's very important to put things in perspective.
Yeah, so many things that you're saying resonate with the research that I watch on things like cyberbullying, which is just bullying, and it is a complex environment. I know that I meet, for example, so many people who want to figure out how to better police their students, their children, who are kind of hyper involved. And of course, we know, for example, once the parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents show up in a social media space that the kids flock. I mean, they flee to and flock to another place. They're completely disinterested. So there is something about, the space for, I think, experimentation, identity experimentation. And one of the things I see so much is that in terms of online culture is that there's this, performative aspect of, I mean, in my community, I'm Black, we call it the dozens, I mean, we have this whole phenomena on Twitter called Black Twitter, where we clap back on something that's happening in the zeitgeist or with people at it might not be anybody famous, just like a funny thing as a way to um, demonstrate a certain kinds of set of politics about something and using humor especially to do that. So there's very complex dimensions, but of course I think many times when people gaze at that, in this case let's say parents gazing at children, it is not widely understood kind of what's happening in those spaces, right? And so the intensity or the worry and fear or the magnitude of that sometimes can really spin out. Having said that, of course, we know that there are things that happen because of the kind of algorithmic amplification of the worst things. And of course, I know this from my work on the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, non-consensual pornography, these kinds of harms, especially that young women experience of being cyber stalked and harassed and harmed. I mean, that is a very real dimension, and our laws are just starting to catch up with these kinds of, acts of violence. So I guess I just wonder, kind of, what are you seeing in terms of the coping mechanisms, how young people are moving through this, and especially, of course, I know that people who are watching want to know, and also what do we do as parents in this milieu?
Such a complicated question. There's so many pieces to it. I mean, just starting with what you said about it being a performative space. I think that there's a big problem, I think, when parents really want to police what their kids are doing, and particularly when they spy on them, let's say, because I deeply believe that everyone needs to have a zone of privacy, some zone of privacy. That doesn't mean that you're not paying any attention to what your kid is doing, but this is when parents spy on their kids and go through their phones and see what they're texting each other, they come across these things that seem like absolute horrors, right? And they miss the fact that a lot of what's there is performative and isn't meant for adult eyes. The kids know what's going on, they know what they're doing, they know what they're saying. I've had a childhood friend once read out loud to me on the phone some letters I had written her from camp. I was mortified by what I was saying. None of it was true. It was so embarrassing, which is why she was reading it out loud to me. But it was completely, I don't know what that was. And I remember in the course of doing the interviews, a middle school teacher saying she had come across something of hers, one of those boards we used to make for our friends with like headlines from magazines and pictures, on a whiteboard. And she said it was so raunchy and disgusting. You would think that she was the most like sexually experienced person on earth. And it was just nothing. And they still do this. They still are doing this. And they are trying out different identities. And I think that they need to have the space to be able to try out different identities while it's still safe. I mean, better when they're still under your roof and they're 12, 13 than when they're off on their own. That said, we have to set standards, but we have to set standards in our own behavior. Saying racist things online is not okay under any circumstance. Um, they have to develop empathy. You can't say just anything. You have to be aware of the fact that words have an impact, that words hurt other people, and that when other people have a reaction to your words, you can't just say like, oh, well, just kidding, or, claim to have been misunderstood. There has to be accountability if you do harm to others. And a lot of that has to come from education at home in terms of what is acceptable and what isn't, and also education in school. When I first started working on the book and I would hear educators talk about sort of online, text meanness, let's say, or mean girl stuff. And when they would say things like, we have to see all of this as an opportunity for education, not pointing fingers and, designating, let's say, a mean girl, quote unquote, because it could be a boy. It sounded a little bit like a cop out. The parent in me would think, well, what if? But when I listened and understood, the way it was explained was that you have kids this age who are at very different levels of maturity and sophistication around language, and genuinely are at different levels of understanding what they're doing with language and what the impact is on another person. And if you just react with a kind of, universal top down punishment for everybody in a certain situation, you miss an opportunity to actually change behavior in the future by getting through to someone about what they're actually doing. And so it's important to look on a case by case basis and also engage with kids to explain to them why what they're doing is wrong. Sort of a long-winded answer, but I think it's such a complicated question.
Yeah, no, I think these are such interesting issues because we think of the internet and the digital, the text speech, the social media speech as somehow different and immaterial and not real. And yet, of course, we know it is expressly real in its consequences, right? And so we do a lot of work as well. I mean, here at UCLA in our Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, we write about really trying to demystify what these technologies are, how they work, and also their very real material effects in the world. And I think this is a place, what you're saying about teaching and contextualizing, sense making. I mean, it's one of the reasons why doing things like, banning lists of words and saying, if these words are spoken, you're out. I mean, the speaker matters, the context, the delivery, the, tonality, the audience, the reception, all these dimensions of like, encoding and decoding language. And I think this all gets flattened when we start talking about how schools and adults respond to the complexity of what young people are trying to do, right? And who they are trying to become in the sense that they're trying to make of the world.
Yes, an age and maturity level and
right.
facility with language. All of those things do absolutely have to come into play. And, a lot of research that's come out since the time I finished the book has actually shown that, I mean, social media in and of itself is a tool. It's, it's a way, it's a tool. It isn't inherently good or bad. It is what we make of it. And that's true for adults as for kids. And I just, we do all this media literacy with kids, but we don't do enough social media literacy. And they need that. They need it early on so that some of the things that cause problems around, with cause anxiety or depression, fear of missing out and feeling always lesser, if they could understand more the performative side of things, for one thing, the idea of, of curating your life, the fact that when they see somebody who seems perfect and everything is great and that this is a curated image, um, these are sorts of ways of approaching social media and kinds of mental sophistication that they really, really need. And they could be much better prepared then for engaging with it and engaging with it productively.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where when we think about things like mental health and well-being, there's a lot of media attention to the idea that what young people do at the age, in this age range, this kind of middle school age range, young high school age range, that that their behavior and their mental health is so destructive, right? And there's an incredible amount of worry. Now, part of me wonders, is that not um, the generations who are not accustomed to these ways that we, these things that we're talking about tonight? Is it just like a generational misunderstanding, or is there really crisis happening among young people? And do we need to, what do we do? I mean, these are some of the things. I mean, I feel like part of what we're talking about is we still live in a racist society. We still live in homophobic and transphobic society. In major cities, class in particular is profoundly divisional and painful, quite frankly. If you're not rich, if then your class status can be a source of pain and embarrassment and tragedy. So I think there's like these tensions around the social structure, and then there's me and you and the parents and the aunts and uncles and the friends and the educators watching tonight who are like, okay, that's messed up. And also, what do I do? So I just wonder, like, how do you navigate and teach us through this?
I mean, I'm just trying to think on which level to enter into this. There's really good research on the effects that structural inequalities have on people, and specifically on kids this age. The more competitive the landscape around you, the less happy people are, you know, the less well they treat each other. When, as one psychologist I quote all the time in my work, Sonia Luther says, when everybody is entirely about, getting to the top, well, there's only room at the top for one person, right? So everything is a zero sum game in terms of human relationships. And so, if we are raising our kids in that kind of society, which we have generally, but if in addition we're choosing to be in that kind of subculture, which many of us do, then we have to be aware that this is what they're surrounded by. And that very often the things that we want for them, the life that we want for them, the kinds of neighborhoods we want them to live in, and the schools we want them to go to, there are great things about all that, but there are also some really bad things about all of that. And we have to be vigilant about it. And we have to be aware of the fact that all of those things are going to impact them really hard in middle school, because that's the time when cognitively they're getting to the point where they're trying to figure out what their place is in the world. So all the messages coming at them about status and about belonging and identity are going to hit them super hard. They're really going to be focused on that. And that's something to be aware of and to help them navigate. And much of how we help them navigate those things has to do with our own values. And, everyone's values are, our stated values and the way we behave are often two different things. It's something to be aware of. I would say, in terms of how overall we interact with our kids to make this period as good as it can be, and there are really good things that can happen in this period, we have to be attuned to what's going on inside ourselves. We started out in the conversation and talking about why I wrote the book, because I knew that there was something going on inside of me that was overmuch, that was overdetermined. The emotion was too strong and it wasn't quite right. And I was curious about that. And I was curious about what was driving the weird behavior, in these other moms around me.
Yeah.
If we can't control our children's universe, I mean, that becomes absolutely clear when they get to be middle school age. Our ability to do that drops off precipitously. But we can or need to be able to be in touch with and control as well as possible what's going on within us and how we're behaving toward them. It's enormous. It's always important. It's enormously important at that point, because even as they push back against us, they also take a lot of their cues from us. And so we've got to be aware of what's getting triggered in us at that
Yeah.
time. A lot gets triggered
Yeah.
precisely at that age.
Yeah, that's so great, Judith. I see that Vicky has joined us, and I know she's probably got tons of questions that are coming in. So, Vicky, I'm going to turn it over to you. But Judith, this has been such a delight to get to talk to you about this. I could talk to you for hours longer.
Absolutely.
So,
It's been a real
I'm
honor.
going to call you. All right.
Absolutely, please.
Okay, great.
Well, and I want to thank you both before we go to the questions. This is such a stimulating, interesting, informative conversation between two incredible women scholars. So thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and expertise and your stories with our open mind audience. So yes, we have many questions and so little time. First question from Sasha. How do we help our kids navigate the changes in relationships? In elementary school, they have friends and change as you grow into middle school or junior high. Wonder if you could comment on that.
Such a good question, because that is such a typical experience. I have this at the tip of my tongue because I was sort of reviewing prior to coming on this program tonight. Um, Half of seventh grade friendships end before the end of the year. This is a time when friendships are very unstable, where it is very typical for friendships to fall apart, people to move in different directions, and especially in the transition from elementary school to middle school. And a lot of it has to do with maturation, rate of maturation. There was a woman who I interviewed who said it's like an algorithm that you're going along together, and then all of these different elements get set into motion where you just are moving this way and that way and this way and that way, and all of a sudden you sort out differently. And I think what's really important, so important to remember as parents, is not to attach value judgments to it. I actually hate using the word maturity because it seems to have an inherent value judgment attached to it that, to be further on, to be more mature in the way that we tend to think of it is the better thing. There is no value to attach to it. This is an age that has the widest range of normal than any other phase of childhood, and it's all normal. The girl, let's say I'll stick with girls, who in early sixth grade is still playing with American Girl dolls, as opposed to the one who's wearing makeup and is you know having romantic interests, etc. All of that's normal. One is not sort of more where she should be than the other, and I think our culture tends to be so normative, and as parents we're so normative and the kids are so normative that we have to guard against that and allow them to be comfortable in being who they are wherever they are, and also see that if a friendship is not working out, if they're sort of breaking apart, that maybe they're just moving in different directions right then. It doesn't mean that they will always be moving in different directions, but it's okay. And also to think about just what makes your kid happy. Who do they feel good around? And if they don't feel good around a friend or a set of friends, if when they're with them they feel insecure, rejected, well, then don't keep knocking at that door. Maybe it's time to look elsewhere. Hopefully they'll be in schools big enough that there's an elsewhere to turn.
Thank you. Several questions here from Lori and Robin and a couple of other people about gender differences. You've referred to Mean Girls quite a bit. How about with boys?
So I try to put it in quotation marks because it's an expression we use all the time and creates the false impression that this is mainly a girl thing. It's not. There is at least one study that shows that boys are just as mean as girls are in this period. Very often girls are doing what they're doing with the boys sort of in the background, setting the standard of what is desirable and what isn't. That's one thing actually that really shocked me, at least with my older daughter's cohort, the degree to which boys still called the shots in terms of sort of who was considered cool, attractive, what was the desirable thing. And frankly, the degree to which the parents backed that up. That probably depends in part on cohort, but that power dynamic is still very much in play. It just tends to be that the meanness expresses itself differently and in different situations. When boys exclude, they tend to exclude from a group. Girls more typically will get involved in alienating somebody from a particular friendship. It's more of an almost one-on-one thing or a triangulated thing. But the underlying stuff that's going on really comes down to the same thing. It's about finding your place. It's about hierarchy. It's about power. And it's also about finding your people at a time that you're distancing yourself from your family, going out into the wider world and looking for the comfort of knowing where you belong.
Thank you. Question from Pia. How do you differentiate what is formative versus not formative when it comes to privacy for your teen?
meaning what's important first and not all that important, like what you have to really, really worry about as opposed to not. I think that is that what is that the sense?
I believe that's the sense of the question. Yes.
I think in part you have to see how they seem to you. I mean, if something is going wrong, you will feel it in your gut. You're not going to know necessarily what it is, but more likely than not, you're going to know when just something is wrong. And I think it's really important to go with your gut. And if whatever it is doesn't resolve, then look for help. Look for help outside of just the bubble of your family. Hopefully, if you're lucky, your child will be in a school where somebody is paying attention, some adult is paying attention, whether it's a homeroom teacher or in some schools, the assistant principal is sort of meant to be roaming the halls, just making sure people are okay and getting a sense of what's going on, in the hallways. Or a counselor, if again, if you're fortunate enough to be in a school with enough personnel, per student that somebody is able to be paying attention to what's going on socially, um, and try to also get your child to orient themselves toward an adult who they like and trust at the school to be able to talk about things, because more often than not they're not really going to want to talk about it with you. Maybe they will, and that's great. And if they do, the important thing is to listen really carefully, to listen and then help guide them toward trying to figure out what they can do rather than rushing in and trying to just, solve it yourself and bringing a lot of excess parental emotion to it.
Thank you. We have time for one more question um, from Barbara. How can parents help their middle school child understand that mean girls and boys do eventually change? Is it possible to lessen the pain?
I think the thing maybe that lessens the pain, I mean, some of the pain is just going to be there. It's just painful to be on the receiving end of exclusion or bullying, which is a strong word, or even just sort of basic level meanness. It really hurts. It hurts no matter what, and it especially hurts at that age. So I think there's a certain degree for parents of just being able to tolerate the fact that your child is in pain. But beyond that, I think it's helpful to know. I mean, sometimes they change, sometimes they don't, in all honesty. The behavior will change, but there are some elements that stay. um, Knowing that people who are mean to other people usually are not feeling very good inside. There's something going on with them in their lives. There's some context for the behavior. They're not having a great time and then going out of their way to make you feel bad. Happy people don't do that. So knowing that, I think, is empowering at a certain level. If you can help them try to think about the context of what larger thing is going on, is something going on in this kid's life? Is there some larger story at work here? And that will make all of this make a little bit more sense. And if there is there something they can do to address this so they don't just feel like they're powerless, in the face of these nameless huge forces, which is what it feels like to be on the receiving end of stuff at that age. Try to get them to think a little bit critically about what's going on around them, about other people's perspectives, what could be going on in people's lives, and then see if there's a way in for being able to change the situation, including finding an adult at school to talk to.
Thank you. Sophia, anything to add to that?
I mean, I just love the things that you're saying, Judith, and I concur that when we think about the internet and the places that our kids are also online, especially when they're making community with each other via, games, video games, and social media and other kinds of spaces and places. I mean, I think it's smart to know, because of course there are many predatory places where our kids are being targeted, profiled, radicalized. There are a lot of things happening, but there are also a lot of really important constructive kind of outlet and community generating things that can also happen that sometimes are not always available right there physically in the classroom, at the school. So we know, especially kids who are in marginalized identities, that they often are finding community in these other spaces and places. So I really love everything, Judith, that you've been sharing. And Vicki, I'm so grateful to have been invited into this conversation with you all tonight. I guess, I would just say that we are all in this together. And one of the things I loved so much about what you're saying is that, it is incumbent upon us to make good people. I mean, we play an active role in talking about what's going on in the streets. I watched in 2020 the uprising in response to the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many people. And I was so surprised how many parents were not talking to their kids about what's going on in the world, and who was talking to their kids. And I think, you really give some good counsel here about, how to not necessarily get involved in the kids' business, but to get them involved in kind of what's happening in the world so that they have the value system to navigate the painful things and to make choices that can actually become incredibly empowering. So I wonder if you just have any parting words for us, because I saw the Q&A, there's so many questions that are just like, help us be better, Judith. So.
Well, I mean, just again, the example that you just gave of 2020, kids at this age are very interested in the larger world. They
Yes.
are very attuned to justice and injustice, and they often are talked down to. They are not given that much information, very good information. I think it's better now. I think education generally is better now than it was when we were that age, and it was, sort of a wasteland. It was just, not interesting. They eat this stuff up, so open the world up to them and let them be
Yes.
able to experience it and learn about it, but of course with guidance. There's so much that can be done educationally in schools and also at home.
That's right. So lovely. Great.
Thank you both. Dan has summed this up perfectly by saying, unfortunately, an hour is just not enough time to get into this.
It's true.
It really
Can I
isn't.
say actually one other thing? Since we didn't get
Yes.
to the questions, if anybody wants to email me directly with questions, I'm happy to respond, and you can do that at judith@judithwarner.com. So
Yes. And please get this incredible book, because there's a lot of answers in this book too.
Thank you.
thank you. And the paperback has a fun cover.
It just came out. Thank you both so much. Really, this was a wonderful discussion and so informative. And I do wish we could go on, but our time is up. We will have to invite you back to continue.
Well, I am honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody who was here tonight and had the privilege of hearing you two speak. Judith, Sophia, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Good evening, everyone.